She bent down quietly to retie a shoelace that had just come undone. Such a mundane action no one would normally notice unless it happened right in the center of Valmont Private Terminal's waiting lounge, a place where even the slightest wrinkle on a collar could get you denied service. A woman in a Versace dress nearby flipped her hair and said loud enough for the whole room to hear. So used to groveling, she probably thinks every place she steps into is her own. Here, even kneeling won't get you served. The laughter that followed was sharp as blades slicing through the air. A man in a Tom Ford suit curled his lip. Who does she think she is? Even the janitors wouldn't walk in here looking like that. Another man sighed with disgust. How did security let someone like her slip through? Ugh, she's staining the whole lounge. But the woman didn't bow her head again. She stood up, tightened the worn-out straps of her backpack, and took another step, slowly, calmly. No rebuttal, no glare, just silence. And that silence, that was what made them uneasy. No Hermes bag, no Cartier watch, none of the symbols of status that they believed were required to exist in this space. Just a faded gray hoodie, frayed sneakers, and a woman, silent but unshakable. The entire room glanced at her with eyes like blades. No one asked who she was. No one cared why she was there. They had already passed judgment. With a single look, someone like her didn't belong. At Valmont, didn't deserve to stand beside those carrying platinum cards or diplomatic passports. A flight attendant murmured, probably wandered in from the maintenance wing. A businessman scoffed, or maybe looking for a public restroom. Another sipped his wine and smirked. Look at that deadpan face. She probably thinks she's starring in some Netflix drama. They all laughed. She didn't. She didn't need to. Her name was Elena Rivera. And in less than 10 minutes, those very same people dripping in luxury, nursing their vintage champagne, wouldn't dare look at her the same way again. Because what they didn't know was that they had just insulted the wrong woman, and the price they were about to pay couldn't be charged to any platinum card they owned. You don't need a knife to hurt someone. All it takes is a smile at the right moment and a sentence light enough to sound polite, yet laced with venom. When Elena stepped closer to the reception counter, the real assault began. A staff member in a Gucci suit suddenly burst into laughter without even trying to cover his mouth. Sorry, are you here to deliver food? Or maybe looking for a job in the kitchen? The words landed just as Elena reached into her bag for her phone. Laughter broke out instantly, like a chain reaction. The receptionist turned to her colleague and whispered, just loud enough, "Look at her backpack. My makeup pouch looks better than that." Behind them, a group of passengers, lounging on velvet sofas, began murmuring among themselves. A middle-aged man, wearing a Richard Mille, lifted his champagne glass and said mockingly, though loudly on purpose, "If I owned this airport, I'd install a poverty detector at the entrance." The clinking of glasses followed. Quiet chuckles echoed in the lounge. Elena said nothing. She simply stood there, eyes fixed on the arrivals screen, where a line of text scrolled Gulfstream G800, now landing. A young woman in a Dior dress walked up to Elena, putting on a falsely polite smile. "Miss, the public terminal is that way all right. This section is for premium guests. Hope you understand." She didn't wait for a reply, just turned around, with a smirk and a look that dripped with pity and mockery. Elena still didn't react. But that silence, it drove the room insane, because they couldn't stand that someone they deemed beneath them wouldn't apologize, wouldn't bow, wouldn't even flinch. Her calmness in their eyes was defiance. And defiance to them deserved to be punished. A security officer stepped forward, his face stern, but with a trace of smug satisfaction. He looked Elena up and down, as if inspecting an unclaimed piece of luggage. "Excuse me, your luggage hasn't been cleared through the VIP scanner. I'll have to ask you to either leave this area or wait in the isolated zone for unidentified guests." The lounge froze for half a second, then burst into light applause, laughter, and satisfied nods. Elena exhaled not from exhaustion, but from clarity. She finally understood. This wasn't just a waiting lounge, it was a stage, and in their eyes, she was the villain simply for not wearing a label. What they didn't know was that the lead hadn't entered yet. No one needed to ask who she was. No need to check her ID. Just a glance at the faded hoodie, the worn-out backpack, and the scuffed sneakers was enough for them to decide someone like her had no business being here. So when the security officer raised his hand and pointed toward a glass door at the end of the hallway, the one leading to the isolation room, usually reserved for suspicious individuals, for those labeled unidentifiable, not a single voice protested. No one said it had gone too far, because to them, it wasn't a situation. It was protocol. Elena nodded. No argument. She walked in silence, yet with every step she took, the laughter behind her grew louder. A man in a pinstripe suit chuckled. "Oh, so they have a separate wing for people who don't understand the concept of class." A woman with her arms crossed muttered just loud enough. "Hope they do a background check. Imposters are getting more sophisticated these days." A child asked his mother innocently, "Mum, is that lady getting arrested?" The mother didn't answer. She just shook her head and whispered, "Probably snuck in. She doesn't look like she belongs here." Eleanor stepped into the glass room. The door closed behind her. The thick pane muted the sounds from outside, but the judgmental stares still cut through. She set her backpack down on a chair. Inside was the technical manual she had been reading, and a handwritten letter folded neatly tucked between the pages as a bookmark. It was meant for her husband. None of those people outside had the slightest idea that the woman now isolated like a criminal was the wife of the man who owned the majority stake in this very airport. And what they really didn't know was that in just a few minutes, every single eye that had looked at her with contempt would be forced to look at themselves in silence. No one noticed the first sound, a distant low rumble, echoing faintly through the soundproof glass walls of Valmont Terminal. But within seconds, every conversation in the VIP lounge came to a sudden halt, as if an invisible signal had swept the room and commanded silence. Behind the massive glass wall, on the private runway, a jet-black Gulfstream G800 was descending, smooth, powerful, and utterly silent, like a sword being unsheathed. The rotors slowed, the engines shut off completely, yet the weight of power still lingered in the air. An airport staffer dashed through the hallway. A VIP golf cart accelerated across the tarmac. Someone in the room whispered, "That G800? It's a custom order, isn't it?" Another nodded, eyes wide. "Only one person uses that black edition. Damian Rivera." And right then, the plane door opened. A man stepped out. No entourage, no assistants carrying luggage, no cameras. Just him, in a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves neatly rolled up, silver-gray sunglasses, and a stride that made the entire terminal hold its breath. Damian Rivera, founder and CEO of Rivera Aerospace, the man who had just acquired 70% of Valmont Terminal in a record-breaking deal. He didn't look around. He didn't speak. He walked straight into the glass building, through a private corridor heading directly for the one person he had flown here to retrieve. When the isolation room door opened, Elena was still sitting, arms wrapped around her backpack. She wasn't surprised. She simply lifted her head at the sound of the door. Damian removed his glasses. His steel-gray eyes swept across the room. landing directly on his wife's. And then he spoke just one sentence, short, sharp, slicing through the suffocating air like a blade. "Why is my wife being detained in here?" That question, spoken without force, without shouting, pierced through every pane of glass, every $1,000 suit, every luxury watch, and cracked the arrogant shell that had sealed the entire room. Damien's question didn't need to be repeated. The entire room froze. Victor Hayes, the head of security, stood motionless at the doorway of the isolation room, his polished nameplate, once gleaming like a badge of authority, now trembled like a scrap of metal. He stammered, I didn't know she was." But Damien didn't need to hear the rest. He locked eyes with Victor, his voice as calm and final as a verdict already handed down. "You just detained the only person I trust on my flight. You have 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings." Victor turned pale. No one spoke for him. No one defended him. No one even dared to breathe loudly. Damien didn't stop. He walked into the room, took Elena's hand gently, and asked, tired. Yet Elena smiled softly and gave a small nod. She didn't need to say a word. The message was clear. Damien squeezed her hand, then turned toward the main lounge, toward the very people who had mocked his wife, now shrinking behind expensive suits like paper-thin armor. He stepped to the center of the room. His gaze swept across each face, from Clara the receptionist, who had mocked Eleanor, to Vanessa Delacroix, the woman who ordered the isolation simply because Eleanor didn't meet her definition of luxury aesthetic. His voice remained calm, but every word sliced like steel across marble. "I had planned to keep my investment in Valmont for 2 more years, but today I've changed my mind." A ripple of dread swept through the room. Damien paused, his eyes cold as forged iron. "I don't invest in buildings filled with prejudice. I build places where the person I love can walk in without needing to bow." Vanessa forced a smile, her crimson lips twitching. "We didn't know who she was." "Didn't know." Damien interrupted his stare, unblinking. "And because you didn't know, you thought that gave you the right to humiliate her." He pulled out his phone, unlocked the screen, and tapped a command. The internal system of Valmont flickered. Notifications started appearing on employees' tablets, access revoked badges, deactivated contracts, terminated. No screams, no objections, just the deafening silence of privilege vanishing in real time while no one could stop it. Damien gave Vanessa one final look. His voice wasn't cold anymore. It was sharp as a whetstone. "Starting today, you are no longer allowed to set foot in any Rivera Group facility. No explanation, no negotiation." The entire room held its breath, and then only one sound remained, the echo of Damien's footsteps, as he turned back, took Elena's hand, and said simply, "Let's go." Damien didn't look back, but the words he spoke next made the entire room lose its footing. With a single nod toward the legal team, waiting just outside, the unraveling began. One by one, notifications started popping up on the devices of staff and guests, fingerprint access, deactivated all privileges, revoked platinum memberships of familiar faces, permanently disabled. A front desk attendant frantically unlocked her iPad only to freeze as her own name appeared on the instant termination list. Clara Holt, the same woman who had smugly told Elena to return to the public terminal, now stood holding an employee badge that no longer worked, her fingers trembling as she failed to open the staff-only door. Vanessa Delacroix collapsed onto a chair, her face pale as the expensive paper tucked inside her Chanel clutch. The luxurious Versace dress she wore was no longer a symbol of status. It had become the final remnant of a reputation that had just been erased. This is a lesson, Damien said, not shouting, but with a clarity that rang like a bell of justice for those who think they can assign someone's worth by the shoes they wear or the bag they carry. In the distance, a man who had mocked Eleanor for her cheap backpack was now being escorted out by security. He was still fumbling with his phone, trying to reach his assistant to fix it, but the signal inside the terminal had been cut by direct order of the Rivera Group. And when a woman who had whispered that Elena must be the help began backing away, dragging her frightened daughter behind her in the face of Damien's gaze, he simply said, "I heard you, and I haven't forgotten." Then he turned to the membership control desk. "Revoke all her privileges and those of everyone with her." No one begged. No one argued. They had believed power came from what they wore, the name engraved on a gate or the numbers in their bank account. But today, they learned a brutal, expensive truth. Real power doesn't need a show. It only needs the right moment and the right person. And today, Elena was that reason, the reason an entire untouchable class was finally forced to bow their heads. Elena didn't look at the people now bowing their heads. She simply walked slowly beside Damien, still holding that old backpack with a frayed corner stitch. But no one dared to judge it anymore. They knew this was the bag that had stayed with her through a journey none of them could even begin to comprehend. No one in that room knew that she used to study aerospace engineering at night, after working full shifts at a small auto garage in the suburbs, that while others vacationed in the Alps, she was prying apart old aircraft components, learning how they worked, armed with nothing but grease-stained hands and a flickering flashlight. That was when Damien first met her at an aviation tech conference. She didn't walk in wearing an evening gown, but with muddy shoe slides with mismatched fonts and a wing prototype that would later become the core design for Rivera Aerospace's breakthrough technology. And none of them knew that during the brutal media attacks against Damien, it was Elena who rewrote the entire brand recovery strategy, working behind the scenes without title, without recognition, without ever needing the spotlight. Because for her, being true to herself was already enough. She never needed to prove anything to anyone. But today, the very world that once dismissed her had no choice but to rise and watch. As she walked past 2 rows of people who once mocked her, laughed at her, and gloated at her supposed place, they now lowered their eyes, too ashamed to utter a word. No one told them to bow. It was her silence that made them. And for Eleanor, that was enough. She didn't need to defeat them. She only needed to outgrow them. The door leading to the runway opened. Afternoon sunlight poured across the marble floor, washing the once glittering room in a pale, hollow light. Elena stepped into the VIP transport vehicle. No music, no announcement, no farewell needed. She still wore that faded grey hoodie. Her backpack still hung off one shoulder. But every step she took echoed like a held breath in the lungs of those who had once laughed at her. No one came to see her off, but no one dared move either. They stood frozen, like witnesses at a quiet funeral for a kind of power they once believed to be untouchable. Damien walked beside her, hand in hand, offering no explanation and no glance back. None was necessary. The Gulfstream G800 blinked to life. Its engines let out a gentle roar. Elena boarded, and just before the aircraft door closed, she turned to look back at the lounge's glass wall, where that long line of people still stood silent, smaller than they had ever been. There was no revenge speech, no "I told you so," only the silence of a woman once cast out by this world, now redrawing the line between them and her with her presence alone. The jet slowly rolled forward, leaving behind 2 rows of bowed heads. No one had ordered them to bow, but they did deeply and genuinely. Inside the terminal, The chandeliers flickered faintly, their glimmer reflecting on the polished floor like the dying lights of a world that no longer made sense. Elena sat in the cabin, her head resting gently against the seat. Damien leaned in and asked quietly, "You okay?" She nodded, no smile, but her eyes shone brighter than any jewel that had ever existed in that building. The plane lifted into the sky. On the runway below, the crowd remained silent, as if hoping the jet's wake might somehow blow away the shame they themselves had created. But it was far too late, because silence isn't just the noblest form of resistance, it is the only verdict the conscience cannot escape. This story reminds us that a person's true worth isn't measured by their appearance, VIP status, or brand labels, but by how they carry their dignity when they're insulted. Elena didn't fight back. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked in silence, and it was that silence that made every person who once looked down on her bow their heads. The lesson is simple. When you know who you are, you don't need to prove it to anyone. If this story moved, you leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Toch Story for more videos that reach deep into the heart.